In the heart of a small southern town, where magnolia trees lined the streets and history hung heavy in the air, 76-year-old Robert Thompson sat quietly on his worn wooden porch, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The year was 2019, and after 50 years of maintaining the same piece of land his grandfather had purchased following emancipation, he found himself entangled in a legal battle that would test not just his resolve, but the very foundations of justice in his community. The trouble began when a large development company, Horizon Enterprises, claimed ownership of part of Robert's land through what they called historical documentation. Robert knew better. He had every deed, every paper, every receipt carefully preserved in a leather folder his father had given him. The land wasn't just property to him, it was his family's legacy, a symbol of their perseverance through generations of hardship. When Robert first received the court summons, his neighbors rallied around him. Mrs. Chen from the local grocery store helped him find a young lawyer fresh out of law school who agreed to take his case pro bono. The community gathered funds for legal expenses, and local historians volunteered to help trace the property's ownership records back to the 1860s. The case seemed straightforward enough. Robert's documentation was complete, his family's ownership clear and unbroken. But when he walked into the courthouse that fateful morning, something felt wrong. Judge William Preston barely glanced at the evidence presented. He seemed more interested in his phone than the carefully prepared presentation Robert's lawyer had put together. As the proceedings continued, it became apparent that Judge Preston and Horizon's legal team shared more than just casual courtroom familiarity. They exchanged knowing looks, used golf references only they seemed to understand, and the judge appeared to have made his decision before Robert's lawyer could even present their full case. The ruling came down like a hammer blow. Despite clear evidence of Robert's rightful ownership, Judge Preston ruled in favor of Horizon Enterprises. The decision wasn't just incorrect, it reeked of corruption. Robert's lawyer was stunned, the local community outraged. But Robert himself remained oddly calm, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. What no one knew was that Robert hadn't come to court unprepared. During his decades working as a high school janitor, he'd become friends with many students who went on to do great things. One of them now worked as an investigative journalist for a major news network. Another had become a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C. Over the past few months, as Robert suspected the judge might be corrupt, he'd been quietly gathering evidence, recording conversations, and building a network of supporters who could help him fight back. That evening, as the sun set over his beloved family land, Robert made a phone call that would set in motion a chain of events nobody in the town could have anticipated. His fight for justice was far from over, in fact, it was just beginning. The quiet, elderly man whom everyone had underestimated was about to show Judge Preston and Horizon Enterprises that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't money or influence, but patience, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to truth. 2 weeks after the court ruling, the local community was still reeling from the shock of Judge Preston's decision. But Robert Thompson's small home had become a quiet center of activity. His former student, Lisa Chen, now a respected investigative journalist, had been methodically piecing together a story that would shake the foundations of the county's judicial system. What started as a simple land dispute had unveiled a pattern of judicial misconduct spanning nearly a decade. Through careful research and confidential interviews with former court employees, Lisa discovered that Judge Preston had been involved in at least 7 other cases involving Horizon Enterprises. In each instance, the judge had ruled in their favor, despite compelling evidence supporting the opposing parties. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert's neighbor, who worked as a cleaning staff at the country club, had overheard conversations between Judge Preston and Horizon's CEO, Richard Barrett. These weren't just casual exchanges, they were discussions about property deals, profit sharing, and future development plans. More importantly, they had happened during the period when Robert's case was being heard, a clear violation of judicial ethics. Meanwhile, Robert's other former student, Anthony Washington, now a civil rights attorney, had been building a legal strategy that would not only challenge Judge Preston's ruling but potentially expose years of systematic corruption. He worked quietly, gathering depositions from other victims of similar land grabs, building a case that went far beyond Robert's individual situation. The local community, initially discouraged by the court's decision, began to rally in new ways. Small business owners who had faced similar pressures from development companies came forward with their stories. Former jury members from previous cases involving Judge Preston and Horizon Enterprises shared their experiences of feeling pressured to reach certain verdicts. Robert's grandson, a tech-savvy college student, helped create a secure website where people could safely share their experiences with judicial corruption in the county. The response was overwhelming. Within days, hundreds of stories poured in, creating a detailed pattern of how wealthy developers had been systematically pushing out long-time residents, particularly from historically black neighborhoods. But Robert knew timing was crucial. In chess, he told Lisa one evening as they reviewed the evidence, the key isn't just having the right pieces, it's moving them at the right moment. He had learned this game from his father, who had taught him that patience was often the strongest weapon in a fight against injustice. The team worked methodically, cross-referencing every piece of information, verifying every claim. They knew that when they moved against Judge Preston and Horizon Enterprises, their case needed to be ironclad. Local law enforcement, initially hesitant to get involved, began to take notice as the evidence mounted. An honest deputy sheriff, impressed by the thoroughness of their investigation, quietly began providing additional documentation of other suspicious cases. Robert's home became a war room of sorts, but not the kind filled with angry protests or violent plans. Instead, it was a place where strategy met wisdom, where modern legal expertise merged with generations of community knowledge. The elderly man who had seemed defeated in court was revealing himself to be a master strategist, coordinating a complex effort to expose corruption while protecting everyone involved. Lisa was putting the finishing touches on her investigative report, Anthony was preparing to file a comprehensive federal lawsuit, and Robert was calmly tending to his garden, knowing that the seeds of justice they had planted were about to bloom. The quiet storm they had been building was about to break, and neither Judge Preston nor Horizon Enterprises would see it coming. The morning Lisa Chen's investigative report aired on national television, it sent shockwaves through the small southern town. The story wasn't just about Robert Thompson's land dispute anymore, it had evolved into an exposé of systematic corruption that had plagued the county's judicial system for years. The report was meticulous, featuring interviews with former court employees, documented evidence of suspicious financial transactions, and a clear pattern of biased rulings that favored wealthy developers. Judge Preston's comfortable world began to unravel. As he walked into the courthouse that morning, he noticed the whispers, the sidelong glances, and the way his usually sycophantic staff suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. His phone was ringing constantly, not with the usual calls from powerful friends, but from journalists seeking comments on the allegations. Meanwhile, Anthony Washington had timed the filing of his federal lawsuit perfectly, submitting it just as the media storm was reaching its peak. The lawsuit wasn't just about Robert's case, it named 15 other plaintiffs who had lost their properties under suspicious circumstances. The documentation was overwhelming, hundreds of pages of evidence showing how Judge Preston had consistently ruled in favor of development companies while maintaining hidden financial connections to them. Robert watched these events unfold from his porch, sipping his morning coffee as reporters gathered at the end of his driveway. He had refused most interviews, letting the evidence speak for itself. His only public statement was simple but powerful: this isn't about revenge. This is about making things right, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been told that justice wasn't for them. The community's response was extraordinary. People who had been afraid to speak out for years began coming forward. A former clerk from Judge Preston's court revealed how she had been fired after questioning certain case assignments. A retired police officer shared recordings of conversations suggesting coordination between the judge and local officials to fast-track certain development projects. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. The judge's own son, burdened by years of watching his father's corruption, decided to break his silence. In a sworn affidavit, he detailed how Judge Preston had used his position to accumulate wealth, accepting bribes disguised as consulting fees, and using offshore accounts to hide the money. The state's Judicial Review Board, which had previously ignored complaints about Judge Preston, was forced to take action. They announced a formal investigation, and within days, Judge Preston was suspended pending the outcome. Horizon Enterprises' stock price plummeted as investors rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. Robert's lawyer from the original case, though young and inexperienced, proved to be an invaluable ally. He had kept detailed notes of every irregularity during the trial, which now served as crucial evidence of judicial misconduct. His dedication to the case, despite losing initially, showed that integrity in the legal profession wasn't completely dead. The FBI's white-collar crime division became involved, expanding the investigation beyond the county lines. They discovered that the corruption wasn't limited to Judge Preston, it was part of a larger network of judicial misconduct that had influenced cases across multiple jurisdictions. As autumn turned the magnolia leaves brown, Robert continued his daily routine, tending his garden, greeting neighbors, and meeting with the growing team of lawyers and investigators working on the case. His calm demeanor never wavered, even as the story grew bigger than anyone had anticipated. He knew that real change takes time, and rushing could lead to mistakes. The local historical society, inspired by the case, began documenting other instances of land appropriation in the county's history. They discovered a pattern dating back decades, where wealthy interests had systematically acquired properties from minority communities through questionable legal means. Robert's case wasn't just about one piece of land, it was about confronting a legacy of injustice that had persisted for generations. The implications of Robert's quiet resistance were reverberating far beyond his small town. His story had become a symbol of hope for others fighting similar battles across the country. News outlets were calling it a masterclass in strategic justice, how one man's patient, methodical approach had accomplished what years of angry protests couldn't. As winter descended on the small southern town, the investigation into Judge Preston's corruption had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. The FBI's probe had uncovered a complex web of offshore accounts, shell companies, and suspicious real estate transactions spanning 2 decades. But it was the discovery of a hidden safe in the judge's lake house that would change everything. Inside, investigators found what Robert Thompson had suspected existed all along, detailed records of every corrupt deal, every bribe, and every fixed case. Judge Preston, despite his technological savvy, was old school. He had kept meticulous handwritten ledgers of his illegal activities, perhaps never imagining they would see the light of day. The safe's contents included photographs, USB drives, and even recorded conversations, a treasure trove of evidence that made the case against him virtually bulletproof. Meanwhile, Horizon Enterprises was facing its own crisis. Shareholders had called an emergency meeting, demanding answers about the company's involvement in the scandal. The CEO, Richard Barrett, tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but his carefully constructed world was crumbling. Longtime board members were resigning, and major investors were pulling out. Robert's quiet strategy was working better than anyone could have predicted. By letting the evidence speak for itself and avoiding direct confrontation, he had given his opponents no ammunition to use against him. They couldn't paint him as an angry troublemaker or dismiss him as a conspiracy theorist. The paper trail was doing all the talking. The local community continued to rally around Robert in unexpected ways. The town's librarian revealed she had been secretly keeping records of unusual court decisions for years, noting patterns that seemed to favor certain developers. Her documentation, combined with the evidence from Judge Preston's safe, painted a picture of corruption so complete that even the judge's staunchest supporters couldn't deny it. Lisa Chen's follow-up reports revealed how the corruption had affected ordinary people beyond land disputes. Small business owners who had been forced to sell, families who had lost their homes to questionable foreclosures, and elderly residents who had been pressured to accept unfair buyouts, all began to see hope for justice. The story was no longer just about Robert's land, it had become a movement for accountability and change. Anthony Washington's federal lawsuit gained momentum as more plaintiffs joined. The judge assigned to the case, a respected federal jurist and known for her integrity, refused attempts by Horizon's lawyers to have the case dismissed. She saw the broader implications of the situation and understood that this case could set important precedents for fighting judicial corruption nationwide. Robert's grandson had expanded the website documenting corruption cases into a full-fledged platform for legal resources and community support. People from across the country began sharing similar stories and strategies for fighting corrupt officials. The site became a beacon of hope for others facing similar battles, proving that one person's stand for justice could inspire thousands. The pressure began to show on Judge Preston. His carefully maintained image of respectability had been shattered, and his former friends in high places were quickly distancing themselves. When he was spotted at the grocery store, looking disheveled and arguing with his wife, people felt not anger, but a sad recognition of how corruption ultimately destroys those who embrace it. One of the most powerful moments came when Robert finally agreed to give a full interview, not to a major network, but to the local high school newspaper. He spoke about his family's history with the land, the importance of standing up for what's right, and how true justice requires patience and strategy rather than force. The interview went viral, with millions sharing his simple but profound message about fighting corruption with wisdom rather than weapons. The FBI investigation expanded to include several other judges in neighboring counties, suggesting that Judge Preston's corruption was part of a larger regional problem. Robert's case had become the thread that, when pulled, began unraveling decades of systematic corruption in the Southern legal system. Robert received an unexpected visitor, Judge Preston's wife. She came not to plead for her husband, but to share additional evidence she had been hiding for years. Her conscience, heavy with the knowledge of her husband's crimes, had finally won out over fear and loyalty. This development would prove crucial in the events to come. Spring arrived in the small southern town, bringing with it winds of change that nobody could have predicted. The evidence provided by Judge Preston's wife had opened up new avenues of investigation that reached into the highest levels of state government. The corrupt network that Robert Thompson's case had exposed was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The state's attorney general announced a special task force dedicated to investigating judicial corruption, using Robert's case as a template for identifying similar patterns across the state. What had started as one elderly man's fight for his family land had evolved into a comprehensive reform of the entire state's judicial system. Meanwhile, Horizon Enterprises was facing its day of reckoning. Internal audits revealed that the company had been involved in similar land grabs in 3 other states, using the same tactics of corrupting local officials and manipulating the legal system. The SEC had launched its own investigation into the company's financial practices, and several major executives were facing criminal charges. Robert's approach to justice had created a new model for fighting corruption. Instead of confrontational protests or violent resistance, his strategy of patient evidence gathering and strategic alliance building had proved remarkably effective. Civil rights organizations across the country began studying his case, incorporating his methods into their training programs. The local community had undergone its own transformation. People who had once stayed silent out of fear were finding their voices. The town council meetings, once sparsely attended, were now packed with engaged citizens demanding transparency and accountability. The local newspaper, inspired by Robert's story, had established a dedicated investigative unit focused on exposing corruption and protecting community interests. Lisa Chen's documentary about the case, titled The Quiet Fight, premiered at a major film festival, bringing national attention to the issue of judicial corruption in small communities. The film featured interviews with dozens of people affected by Judge Preston's rulings, painting a powerful picture of how corruption at the local level can destroy lives and communities. Anthony Washington's federal lawsuit had grown to include over 50 plaintiffs, and the evidence was so compelling that Horizon's lawyers had initiated settlement talks. But Robert and the other plaintiffs weren't interested in just monetary compensation, they wanted systematic change. Their demands included the establishment of an independent oversight committee for land development projects and new transparency requirements for judicial financial disclosures. Robert's grandson had expanded the anti-corruption website into a full-fledged nonprofit organization, providing resources and support for communities fighting similar battles across the country. The platform had become a powerful tool for connecting victims of judicial corruption and sharing successful strategies for pursuing justice. The most surprising development came from the local business community. Inspired by Robert's stand against corruption, a group of small business owners had formed an alliance to promote ethical development practices. They were working on a community-owned development model that would ensure local residents had a say in how their neighborhoods evolved. Judge Preston, facing multiple federal indictments, had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency. His testimony implicated dozens of other officials and revealed a pattern of corruption that had persisted for generations. The old power structure was crumbling, making way for a new era of transparency and accountability. Robert's original lawyer, who had fought so hard in that first seemingly hopeless case, was now teaching a course at the state law school about ethics and corruption in the legal system. He used Robert's case as a prime example of how patience, strategy, and unwavering commitment to truth could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The Historical Society's research into past land appropriations had led to the creation of a reconciliation commission, aimed at addressing historical injustices and ensuring they wouldn't be repeated. Robert had been asked to serve as honorary chairman, a role he accepted with his characteristic humility and wisdom. Robert spent more and more time in his garden, teaching young children from the neighborhood about the importance of tending to their roots, both literal and metaphorical. His land had become more than just property, it was a symbol of resistance against corruption and a testament to the power of persistent, peaceful pursuit of justice. 1 year had passed since Robert Thompson's case first made headlines, and the changes it sparked continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. The small southern town had become an unlikely pillar of judicial reform, with delegations from other communities regularly visiting to study what locals had started calling the Thompson Method, a systematic approach to exposing and eliminating corruption through patient, strategic action. The state legislature had passed the Thompson Transparency Act, requiring all judges to submit detailed financial disclosures and establishing an independent commission to investigate allegations of judicial misconduct. The law had already led to investigations in several other counties, with 3 more judges stepping down under scrutiny. Horizon Enterprises had undergone a complete transformation. After filing for bankruptcy protection, the company had emerged under new leadership, with a board that included community advocates and ethics experts. They had established a fund to compensate victims of their previous corrupt practices and were working to develop a new model of community-centered development. Robert's story had caught the attention of civil rights organizations nationwide. He had been invited to speak at law schools and community organizations, sharing his message about fighting corruption through patience and strategic thinking rather than confrontation. Though he accepted some invitations, he preferred to spend most of his time mentoring young people in his community, teaching them about the power of persistent, peaceful resistance. The local high school had developed a new civics curriculum based on the case, teaching students about the importance of civic engagement and the practical steps they could take to ensure accountability in their local government. Robert often visited these classes, answering questions and sharing insights from his experience. His simple wisdom and quiet strength made a lasting impression on the young people who would become the next generation of community leaders. Lisa Chen's documentary had won several awards and was being used as a training tool by anti-corruption organizations worldwide. She had started a fellowship program for investigative journalists focused on exposing judicial corruption in small communities, naming it after Robert's mother, who had always taught him to stand tall in the face of injustice. The federal investigation had expanded to examine similar patterns of corruption in other states. Investigators discovered that the tactics used against Robert were part of a broader strategy employed by various development companies to acquire valuable properties through corrupt judicial decisions. The FBI had established a specialized unit dedicated to investigating these cases, using the evidence from Robert's case as a blueprint. Anthony Washington's legal victory had set important precedents for similar cases across the country. The settlement agreement included not just financial compensation but also structural reforms that would prevent similar abuses in the future. More importantly, it provided a legal framework for other communities fighting similar battles. Robert's grandson had turned the anti-corruption website into a national platform, connecting communities facing similar challenges and providing resources for fighting corruption effectively. The platform included detailed guides, legal templates, and a network of volunteer experts willing to help other communities stand up to corrupt officials. The town itself had become a model of transparent governance. The new town council, elected in the wake of the scandal, had implemented strict ethical guidelines and created multiple channels for citizen oversight. Regular town halls allowed residents to voice concerns and participate in development decisions, ensuring that the community's interests were protected. Judge Preston's cooperation with authorities had led to the indictment of several state-level officials and exposed connections between corrupt judges and development companies in other regions. His detailed testimony provided valuable insights into how corruption networks operate and how they could be dismantled. The Reconciliation Commission had made significant progress in addressing historical injustices. They had identified dozens of cases where properties had been unfairly taken through corrupt legal proceedings, and were working to provide restitution to affected families. Robert served as an advisor to the commission, helping them understand the human cost of corruption and the importance of thorough documentation. Robert sat in his garden, surrounded by young fruit trees he had planted during the previous spring. These trees, he told a visiting journalist, will take years to bear fruit, just like justice. But if you plant them right, tend them carefully, and have patience, they'll feed generations to come. His words captured the essence of his approach to fighting corruption, the understanding that lasting change requires both immediate action and long-term vision. 18 months after Robert Thompson's initial court battle, his impact on the American justice system had exceeded anyone's expectations. A small claims case over family land had evolved into a national movement for judicial accountability, proving that one person's stand for justice could ignite transformative change. The Thompson Transparency Act had been adopted by 12 other states, with more considering similar legislation. Legal experts were calling it the most significant reform in local judicial oversight since the civil rights era. Robert's methodical approach to gathering evidence and building community support had become a blueprint for fighting systemic corruption. During a warm autumn afternoon, as Robert walked through his property with a group of law students from the state university, he shared insights that went beyond legal strategy. "The land teaches us patience," he explained, pointing to an old oak tree. "This tree didn't grow strong overnight, and neither does justice. But once those roots take hold, nothing can shake them." The FBI's specialized unit investigating judicial corruption had uncovered similar patterns in more than 30 counties across 5 states. Their findings revealed how development companies had systematically exploited weaknesses in local judicial systems to acquire valuable properties, particularly in minority communities. The investigation had led to the resignation of 17 judges and the indictment of dozens of corporate executives. Lisa Chen's documentary had sparked a series of investigations by other journalists, leading to the creation of a nationwide network of reporters focused on judicial accountability. They called themselves Thompson's Watchdogs, using data analysis and collaborative research to identify patterns of corrupt judicial decisions across the country. The nonprofit organization started by Robert's grandson had grown into a powerful force for change, providing technical support and resources to communities fighting corruption. They had developed a sophisticated database tracking suspicious judicial decisions and property transfers, making it easier to identify potential corruption before it became entrenched. Robert's original lawyer had established a legal clinic specializing in cases involving judicial misconduct. The clinic provided pro bono services to vulnerable communities and trained law students in the strategic approach that had made Robert's case successful. The Thompson method isn't just about winning cases, he often told his students. It's about changing the entire system from within. The Reconciliation Commission's work had led to the creation of a national database of historical land appropriations, helping other communities identify and address similar injustices. Their research revealed patterns of systematic dispossession that had persisted for generations, hidden behind seemingly legitimate legal proceedings. Local government had been transformed. The town's new ethical guidelines and transparency requirements had become a model for other communities. Regular citizens actively participated in development decisions, and the local economy was thriving under a new approach that balanced progress with community interests. One of the most significant developments came from an unexpected quarter. A group of ethical developers, inspired by Robert's story, had created a new business model they called community-first development. This approach required extensive community consultation and profit-sharing agreements with local residents, ensuring that development benefited existing communities rather than displacing them. Judge Preston, who had initially seemed like the villain of the story, had become an unlikely ally in the fight against corruption. His detailed testimony about how judicial corruption operates had led to the development of new preventive measures and early warning systems. He often spoke to law students about the subtle ways corruption can corrupt even well-meaning officials. Robert's Garden had become a gathering place for community leaders from across the country, seeking wisdom about fighting corruption in their own communities. He taught them about the importance of documentation, strategic thinking, and building strong community networks. Corruption thrives in darkness, he would say, but it can't survive when people shine a light together. The high school civics curriculum based on Robert's case had been adopted by schools in several states. Students learned not just about how government should work, but about practical ways to ensure it worked for everyone. The program included hands-on projects where students investigated local issues and developed strategies for positive change. Robert received news that the Supreme Court had agreed to hear a case that would test the constitutionality of the new judicial oversight laws. The outcome would determine whether the reform sparked by his case would become a permanent part of the American legal system. Though others were nervous about the court's decision, Robert remained characteristically calm. "Truth," he said, "has a way of finding its path. Our job is just to keep clearing the way." 2 years had passed since Robert Thompson first walked into that courtroom, and the morning of the Supreme Court's decision dawned clear and bright. The nation waited to hear whether the judicial reforms inspired by his case would be upheld. Robert spent the morning as he always did, tending to his garden, the same land his grandfather had worked nearly a century ago. The Supreme Court's decision was unanimous: the Thompson Transparency Act and related reforms were constitutional. Chief Justice Williams, writing for the court, cited Robert's case as a prime example of why such oversight was necessary. When justice becomes corrupted at the local level, it undermines the very foundation of our democracy. The reforms sparked by the Thompson case provide essential safeguards for ensuring judicial integrity. The decision triggered a wave of reform across the country. States that had been waiting on the ruling immediately began implementing their own versions of the Thompson Transparency Act. The FBI's Judicial Corruption Unit reported that the mere existence of these new oversight measures had led to a significant decrease in suspicious judicial behavior. Robert's impact on legal education had become permanent. Law schools across the country had incorporated the Thompson case into their ethics curriculum. Students studied not just the legal principles involved, but the strategic patience that had made his approach so effective. The Thompson method had become a recognized term in legal circles, representing a comprehensive approach to fighting systemic corruption. The community-centered development model pioneered in Robertstown had spread to cities across the country. Developers who initially resisted the new approach were now embracing it, finding that working with communities led to more successful and profitable projects in the long run. The town itself had become a case study in sustainable development, proving that progress and preservation could go hand in hand. Lisa Chen's documentary series had expanded to cover similar cases across the country, each showing how ordinary citizens were using Robert's methods to fight corruption in their own communities. The series had won multiple awards and, more importantly, had inspired a new generation of activists and journalists dedicated to exposing corruption. The Reconciliation Commission's work had led to the return of properties to over 300 families who had lost their land through corrupt judicial decisions. Each case was a small victory for justice, and each property returned represented the healing of a historical wound. Robert attended many of the ceremonies where families reclaimed their land, quietly celebrating each victory for justice. Robert's grandson had expanded the anti-corruption organization into an international network, sharing resources and strategies with communities fighting corruption around the world. The platform had become a powerful tool for global justice, connecting people across continents in their fight for transparency and accountability. The high school civics program had evolved into a national model for teaching young people about civic engagement and social justice. Students who had taken the course were now entering college and careers with a deep understanding of how to effect positive change in their communities. Many cited Robert's story as their inspiration for pursuing careers in law, journalism, or public service. Judge Preston, having served his reduced sentence, had dedicated himself to speaking about judicial corruption at law schools and justice reform conferences. His insider's perspective, combined with genuine remorse, made him an effective advocate for change. He often spoke about how Robert's dignified resistance had forced him to confront his own corruption. The local community had been transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The town council meetings, once dominated by a few powerful voices, now featured diverse participation from all parts of the community. Development decisions were made transparently, with careful consideration of their impact on all residents. Robert's garden had become a living classroom where he taught young people about more than just growing plants. Every seed you plant, he would tell them, is a vote for the future you want to see. And every time you tend to something with care and patience, you're building the world you want to live in. In the final days of autumn, as Robert sat on his porch watching children playing in the community garden that had been established next to his property, a young reporter asked him if he ever imagined his fight for justice would have such a far-reaching impact. Robert smiled and pointed to a dandelion seed floating on the breeze. "See that seed?" he said. "It doesn't know where it's going to land or what it's going to change. But it carries within it everything needed to break through concrete and bring new life. Truth is like that. Plant it, nurture it, protect it, and it will grow in ways you never expected. The most important thing is to keep planting those seeds of justice, even when you can't see exactly how they'll grow." As the sun set on this final chapter of Robert's story, his legacy had become clear. One man's peaceful stand against corruption had grown into a movement that transformed not just a town or a state, but the very way Americans thought about justice. His quiet persistence had proved more powerful than any show of force, and his strategic patience had accomplished what generations of angry protests could not. The story of Robert Thompson, the elderly black man who took on a corrupt judge and won, would be told for generations to come. But more importantly, his methods would be used by countless others in their own fights for justice. His garden would continue to grow, his wisdom would continue to spread, and the seeds of change he planted would keep breaking through concrete, bringing light to dark places, one peaceful victory at a time.